Good morning. Today's scriptures are Psalm 1 and Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. So I would invite y'all to pause the video now, read Psalm 1, and then Mark 9, verses 30 to 37. And then come on back with me for a sermon about humility today. So today, Dr. William Hood is a retired professor of art history at Oberlin College in Ohio. In the late 1950s, however, he was still a college student who had a chance encounter with a larger-than-life figure. He tells a story about that encounter, which was brought to my mind this week by our reading from Mark chapter 9. 1968, Hood was a college student in Atlanta, and he attended a small dinner party with a couple of his friends. To his great surprise, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, Coretta, were also in attendance. So when the Kings arrived, the whole room grew very, very still. After all, these were national figures, and here they were at a local dinner party. The college students were afraid to say a word, and the host was away in the kitchen. So naturally, as he tells the story, it was the dog, a corgi, who greeted the Kings first, who broke the ice. Coretta King, he remembers, knelt down to rub the dog's belly while Martin took their coats to the closet. The students offered Coretta a drink, very well aware of the fact that she was the wife of a Baptist minister, so they made sure to tell her about the non-alcoholic drinks they had available, and she said she'd be happy to have a Coke. Martin returned to the room, and they offered him a drink as well. And he said, "Are there any Baptists here?" And they said, "No, sir. We're all Episcopalians." And he said, "Well, in that case, I'll have a scotch on the rocks." And Coretta said she'd have a sherry instead of a Coke. Hood found himself amazed at the humility of the Kings that night at that unexpected dinner party. Even though they were on television every day and they were in the newspapers, at the dinner party that night, he remembers that they were just like everybody else. When the conversation turned serious, everyone looked to Martin for his views on the Vietnam War, poverty, race relations, but he didn't ever want the conversation to be about him and his work, so instead, he turned to Hood, this young man who he'd only met that night, college student he would never see again in his life. But he looked at young William Hood that night directly in the eye, and he said, "Tell me what you're studying and why." And then he listened. As Hood tells it, King looked at him with a keen intensity that let him know he was actually listening and caring and wanting to know who this young man was and what he intended to do with his life. He described the humility that he saw in King that night as a kind of energy that had a liberating effect on everyone in the room. Who are some of the most humble people that you've known in your life? Think about those folks for a moment. What made them humble? It's sort of hard to describe humility. You know it when you see it, but it's hard to describe positively. You can say what it's not, but it's hard to say what it is. Jesus describes humility this way. He says, "Whoever wants to be the first must be last and servant of all." Now, if you've grown up in the church, you've heard that idea thousands of times. The first will be last, and the last shall be first. But what did Jesus mean by that in his day and in his culture? Well, everybody in Jesus' day knew who the first were. It was the wealthy. There was no middle class in Jesus' day. Zero middle class. In his day, there were the landowners and then everybody else. 1% owned everything, including the other 99% of the population. There was no Galilean dream where you could work your way up from the slums into the suburbs if you got a corporate job and invested your money. There just weren't those opportunities. There wasn't a middle class. So the first were the select few wealthy landowners, and the last was everybody else. Jesus' message in that world was that whoever wants to be first must be last of all. Why would Jesus preach that to his disciples? What would be so important about humility? Well, because their society viewed wealth as an indication of importance, and he turns that idea on its head. For Jesus, putting others before yourself is really what makes you important. Humility. If you were rich, you could be first in God's eyes by serving your less fortunate brothers and sisters. And if you were not rich, if you were part of that other 99% of the population who was always last in this life, well, you could be first too by simply serving your neighbors. And so in that way, Jesus' message was for everyone, in every circumstance. The humility that he preached knew no bounds. It was available and applicable to everybody. He even practiced it himself when he healed someone, particularly in Mark's gospel. What did he tell them after he healed them? He'd say, please don't say anything about this to anybody else. There's no need to call attention to it. When he'd had a long day and would rather just take a nap, but someone came to him with a sick little girl, what did he do? He put that nap on hold and he healed the child. This week, in trying to figure out what humility means positively for our society today, I read a definition of humility in Psychology Today, and it said this: humility is a state of freedom from me first thinking, which our culture teaches us to do at every possible turn. A state of freedom from me first thinking. How's that sound to you? Sound good? Sounds great to me. Remember Hood in The Room with King, where he said that King's humility had a liberating effect on him? Think about the most humble people that you have known. Did the humility of your heroes have a liberating effect on you? Did they make you feel like nothing was weighing you down and anything was possible? I've been thinking this week, what if the church was more humble? What if we as a people, we as an institution, were liberated from me first thinking? It's no secret that most of our churches were built for 3 or 4 more times the people who attend today. We argue all the time about why that is. It's been the case over the last several decades, exacerbated by COVID. There was a bit of a return after COVID, but it's just continued. The trends have continued. We argue all the time about why those trends exist. Is it because we've taken stands on social issues? Is it because we've become more divided as a nation, as a world? Is it because we've failed to speak up for people who are hurting? Is it because people are just too busy to develop the discipline of being part of a faith group, coming to worship every week? Or is it because the church, we are just too busy taking care of aging buildings to do ministry and mission? We've wondered all these questions for decades, and I think it's probably much simpler than all that. We've been too busy trying to be first instead of being last. Our call is not to be the biggest or the best or the most attractive. Our call is not to be the most glitzy or glamorous or shiny church on the block. Our call is not to be the it church. Doesn't it feel liberating to have the weight lifted from your shoulders of those expectations? It allows us to relax and be who we were called to be. Last, just people who serve our neighbors. That's it. Reinhold Niebuhr, the great American theologian, taught that humility was an ethic. That infers that it's not just some choice that you make, but it's a constant series of choices. It's not just one choice, but it's a series of choices that you make over and over again over a long period of time. It's a discipline. Humility is a discipline for Niebuhr, a series of habits strung together, a pattern with a surprising result. The surprising result of humility is not meek, mild lowliness. That is what people normally think of when they think of humility. In fact, if you look up the first definition in the dictionary, sorry for the mix-up, you try and say that. If you look up the definition in the dictionary, that's the first thing that you'll see. But the humble are not weak. Bring back to mind that example of humility that you thought about before, that person who's an example of humility to you. That was not a self-conscious, weak, lowly person, was it? Our society thinks of humility in those terms, but they couldn't be more wrong. The humble are confident. The humble are liberated. The humble have a peace of mind and a peace of heart. Like a child who will dance to their heart's delight when everyone's watching and couldn't care less. The humility of Christ liberates each of us to be first in God's eyes. Thanks be to God. Amen.